Okay, a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. I need to ask you to email me your exam schedule. You will find that in the registration materials, and if I'm at all organized, a link here on the home page of the course website. This is the temporary or provisional exam schedule. It changes only a very little bit when it's finalized, which will happen in a couple of weeks. So if you check on page 19 through 22 of the spring registration materials, you will see for your other courses. If you do have a conflict, just let me know in the email that you send to me. What I will do is then sit down and figure out somewhere between 1 and 3 probably dates where you have a day free, and that's when the exam will be given. I'll give you a whole lot more detail about the exam later on in the semester and a little bit more detail about the scheduling once I have those dates. But for now, I need you to email me your dates so I can figure out what those dates will be. And the sooner I get everybody's email, the sooner I get to figure out those dates. So thank you in advance for that. Other housekeeping item for the well, a couple other for the moment. I really have too much to squeeze in for today's topics than we have time for. So what will very likely happen is that we will have to push the last workshop. We're actually doing 2 different workshops. So we'll have to push the last one till next class. Fear not, there will be time at the end for you to finish that up if we don't get enough time to do it today. And finally, I just had a question regarding the screencasts. Can you do them over? I set it up to allow you to, but it sounds like it's not letting you to. Bottom line, don't worry about your score. The idea of these screencasts is to get you to start to think about these issues and give you an introduction. So we save a little bit of time in class so we can focus more on workshops. So today, for instance, we are going to do 2 workshops. We'll always have a last question asking you if you have any questions. Please do fill that in. I look at those. I did that today at about 1:30, 2 o'clock. So if you did the screencast after that, I didn't see your question, so feel free to ask it now. But if you get to it before about that time on Tuesday, I will see your question and make sure that I address it in class. So that is what I am going to do next. And so how I address them in class is I highlight a few that I will cover separately, and then the rest of them I try to work through as we go through the material for class. If I get to the end and you feel like I haven't addressed your question, please ask. Remember, that's one of our themes. Okay, so some of your questions. Could you explain more the research process, the steps to conduct the research process? And I felt related to that another question, is there ever a time where using secondary sources would be detrimental to your research? So the research process, as I mentioned last time, unfortunately, there's not a single series of steps I can give you, or I can say, for every single issue, follow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're good. Every issue is going to be slightly different. It's going to depend on what the issue is, how complex it is. So the one we're looking at in class is very complex. So it's going to take a lot of time, and you're going to want to check a lot of different resources. There will hopefully be some research issues that are pretty straightforward, and you really don't need to spend much time. There may even be some research issues that either you've done before or are familiar with, or are just very basic so that, yes, you could dive straight into cases and just look at that. I've been told, I haven't done research in this area, but I've told some basic real estate type questions. You just check the case law real quick, you get your answer, and you're done. Sometimes there's a couple of single secondary sources, which I will highlight throughout the semester, where you can just check that and quick and dirty, you don't have a lot of time. So that's the answer to sort of the first question. The second question, detrimental to your research, I would say you don't want to get lost in secondary resources. So it would be detrimental if you just spend all your time in secondary and don't leave time for the all-important primary. There's always more to be found. Whether that's a good use of your time is another question. And again, that depends on your particular issue, on your time constraints. We'll talk about how you start to know when your research is finished, again, later on in the semester after we've seen the various resources. Okay, so in evaluating different types of secondary sources while doing research on a particular area of law, why is it better to begin with an encyclopedia or ALR? So it isn't always better. A few of you I saw in the questions thought it was always better to start with an encyclopedia. Again, there's no hard and fast rule. Encyclopedias, ALR, are good because they're fairly basic. Are they always a good place to start? No, sometimes a treatise is going to be a good place. Law review articles are fabulous places because they go into a lot of depth. Really, the best place to start is the one that sounds like it's going to answer your question. And I'll talk about how you start in just a little bit. Okay, if possible, I would appreciate more discussion on how we navigate Westlaw practical law. We will be doing that just later on in the semester. I'll have to beg your patience on that. Do you consider any resource, Westlaw, Lexis, Bloomberg, better for accessing secondary materials in either breadth or resources or content? In that same vein, are there any secondary sources that are exclusive to any of these research databases? And again, the answer is the different resources have different strengths and different weaknesses. Sometimes for case research, I really love the key number system because it gives you a very powerful, advanced, targeted way of doing case research. We'll be discussing that. Different resources, Lexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg, have different treatises. They vary very much in the difference of coverage when it comes to treatises. So as I mentioned last time, Nimmer on copyright, one of the leading treatises on copyright, is only on Lexis. Westlaw only has McCarthy on copyright, which is also a good treatise. So there's an area where they are different. Better, once again, it depends on what you need to do. Bloomberg's going to be much stronger on very business-oriented treatises, for example, and other resources, not just treatises. Okay, as I said, I'm going to try to address the other questions that I know about as we go through the materials. If there's something still outstanding, by all means ask as we're going through, if you're burning to know, or at the end, or even next time. Okay, so one of the other questions, which is where I plan to start today's material, is the research log. I mentioned that in one of the screencasts. One of you asked for an example. And so what I have, one of the handouts I've given you, this is also available on the course website under the secondary sources research module, is basically a strategy for keeping a log. So what you want to be thinking about, successful search terms, secondary sources you may get references to, obviously additional questions as they come up. Also, obviously, I hope any references to primary sources. One of you asked about how best to find cases through secondary materials. Secondary materials will refer to cases either in the text or the footnotes. That's one of their main strengths, as I hope you learned from the screencast. So here's some of the rationale behind keeping a research log. Basically to keep track. Life is going to happen. You're going to get interrupted. You're not going to have 8 hours straight where all you need to do is research. Trust me, that happens to me on an almost minute-by-minute basis in terms of getting interrupted. So if you keep some sort of log, now what I'm giving you is a very detailed one, and you have to be pretty disciplined in order to keep all of this. So this is just one example. Start with it and then find what works for you. Lexis and Westlaw both, as well as Bloomberg both, all have histories. So that's another way. They all have folders. So those are other ways to keep track of your research and what you're doing without quite this much effort. Any questions? Yeah.
You're for a firm that has to pay for the services, obviously. If you store something in the folder and you access it later, do you know if it gets charged double, or once you place it in the access it at the time, it would just be an initial download?
My understanding is that's one of the advantage to folders, is if you put it in the folder, you won't be charged again but confirm that because they're always changing the rules. And that's actually one of the questions somebody asked is, how do I know how much all this costs? I'm paraphrasing on that one. I didn't read it here. And the answer is ask. I tried to give you a general sense for those of you who did or are doing the extra credit. That will give you a slightly more detailed sense. But the general basis is you have a contract and somebody in your firm negotiates the contract. Ask that person, because what's in your contract you basically don't have to worry about. What's outside of your contract is what you do have to worry about. And what tends to be outside of the contract, especially for smaller organizations, are secondary materials. And they, as we discussed a little bit, tend to also be the more expensive. But excellent question. Any other questions on the research log? Okay. So hopefully, as you watched the screencasts, I am beginning to convince you that secondary sources make sense as a general rule, again, always just a general rule, as a place to start for all of the reasons that were discussed in the screencast. If any of you still haven't done it, there's still time, and I will ask you to go back and do it before next class, and you'll still get credit because a little bit of review and reinforcement for those of you who haven't done it will be useful. For those of you who had, as I said, hopefully you are beginning to get convinced that it's worth taking the time to first go to secondary sources before first diving into case law. So we started to talk about secondary sources last time in terms of Google, right? Because probably that's the first instinct for a lot, if not all of you, to start, and that's perfectly fine. As I said last time, and hopefully I'll say another 1,000 or 2,000 times, just don't stop there. So we started in Google, and we had thought about our issue, and we had figured out some of our search terms, and we came upon sort of HMO liability, maybe adding in denial of treatment, and started to look at our Google results, and came across some law firms, which we discussed how to figure out reliability. And of course, law firms are trying to sell something, their services. So they may present a slightly not incorrect or even biased, but they're going to present their point of view as to why they should hire you. So they may try to present to you the best reason for bringing a case, which maybe our client, remember, may not even have a good case. And we don't want to be spending a lot of our time and her money if she really doesn't have a case. So we looked at those law firms, deciding we'll look at those sites to see what we can learn, but we're not relying on it. We're just sort of at the gathering information or clues if we're on our detective hunt, another analogy that I like. So here's some of the firms I'm scrolling past, Dolman Law. And then we came across a .gov from the NIH, which if we didn't know that stands for the National Institutes of Health, we could obviously, of course, Google it. And I suggested to you, again, tends to be reliable. .gov, National Institute of Health, you may or may not have heard, is a very well-respected organization. And a lot of times, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about administrative materials, looking at a particular agency's material, if an agency is giving us guidance in their particular area, it's probably a good idea to at least look at it really carefully, if not follow it, because, right, that's the agency that's developing some of the laws in the form of regulations. And again, we'll talk a lot more about that later in the semester. So definitely worth looking at. So here we see this NIH article, Health Plan Liability and ERISA, expanding scope of state legislation. And so we, again, learning about ERISA. We are also, as we read it, learn about actions that were preempted by ERISA. And so we get some background here about the U.S. healthcare delivery system. Some questions that came up in our issue spotting is just how we need to learn more about how all of this works. Here's a place to do that. Of course, we want to be bibliographically aware, and we see that it is 2005. So again, we're not going to just ignore it, oh, that's too old, but we're going to put in very much the middle, if not the front of our mind, this is 2005. I'm going to learn from this, but I'm not going to rely on it being up to date. So even just getting to the next page here, we learn again this idea of preemption. And let me see if I can highlight that for you. It helps if you don't have a typo in there when you do that. Yeah, there we go. So here again on the second page, it's talking about a result of the preemption of state laws. So we're learning, okay, this whole preemption thing. Part of the reason you go to law school is to learn about these concepts. Have any of you run across the concept of preemption of state laws by federal law? You must have talked about that in Civ Pro, I hope. Okay, so yeah, I'm seeing some head shaking yes. Okay, so we might have to worry about this. So this is another in our research log or just our list of questions to check out. Do we have to worry about preemption? Okay. So we've done some of our preliminary secondary resource search in Google. Now's the time, so that's more general interest. Now's the time to dive into more legal-based analysis, so legal secondary sources, because we got all of these sources on Google, not all, many of these sources on Google tend to be geared to the general public. We need a more legal understanding, and for a more better legal understanding, we need to go to legal research materials. So now's the time to dive into some of those secondary sources that I talked about in the screencast. And so to do that, I'm going to divide you up into groups, and then I'll talk about what you need to do. Don't worry, I'm not going to, for now, I'm just going to divide you up to keep it quick, because as I said, we're tight on time today. So we 5 groups, I think there are 18 of you, so I'm going to practice my names as well. So Nashe, Daniel, Taylor, and Isabel, I'm going to ask you to look at ALR, and don't worry, I'm going to show you all how to do this in a moment. Okay, so Andrea, Dolores, Ali, right? You like Ali and Vanessa. I'm going to ask you to all look at Amger. Okay, Aladia, Andrea, Beza, Angelo, right? Yeah. Get so excited when I remember names. Okay, so we have ALR, CJS. Okay, Luke, Chrissy, and Muhammad. I'm going to ask you to look at something called proof of facts, and don't worry, I'll explain that. And you can only look on Westlaw, by the way, because that's the only place. So there's an example. Westlaw only has proof of facts. And finally, Marilyn, Maggie, and Jenny, I'm going to ask you to look at New York jurisprudence. And now we're going to talk a little bit about strategy, and then I'm going to show you all how to get to your assigned resources. And so the strategy, and actually I'm going to ask you to do this as you get to your assigned resources. Again, there's no always correct way, but especially if you don't know much or anything about a particular area, what I recommend, starting again in secondary sources, is to start, and I'll show you on both services. You get to choose, by the way, Lexis or Westlaw, with the exception of proof of facts, because that's only Westlaw, and with the exception of the CJS group, because that's also only Westlaw. Okay, so let's start secondary sources. So this is my recommendation. I'm going to ask you to follow this process to get into the habit, but this is also my recommendation when you don't know much about an area. Start with generally secondary sources. And yes, you can narrow to the particular one. So since I've assigned you a particular one, you could narrow here, but I'm suggesting as a general rule, when you don't have somebody saying search ALR or search Amger, this is where you want to put in your search. So I'm going to do an example back from the first year that you saw presented, drunk driving. And then looking at your results, once they come up, first thing I do is see if there's anything useful. Don't worry about the name of the resource, the type of the resource. Ultimately, you want to find a secondary source that helps explain the law to you. So if you were in New York, seeing New Jersey drunk driving law isn't particularly useful. And so you see a whole lot of New Jersey drunk driving law, and you see a law review here, maybe that's useful. So you scroll through and make that analysis looking at the source as I am to determine whether or not it's going to be useful. Again, you don't want to just pay attention to the title, because if it's in New Jersey and your issue's in New York, it's not going to help you. Then what you might want to do as you're scrolling through, you might determine, wow, this isn't very useful. I've learned that ALR is really great to check. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but let me see if there's a really good one, because if there is, it'll help me a lot. So I'm going to, here on Westlaw, I'm going to look at publication type, and there's ALR. I could also narrow to other types of sources. Another way to narrow on Westlaw, and I'm going to be is by publication name, and there I see American jurisprudence as well as New York jurisprudence. So the AmJur and New York Jur, this is how you would narrow here if you didn't see anything initially in your results. You proof of facts group, if you do not see anything in your initial results, what you will need to do, and unfortunately the Westlaw just doesn't make this as easy as they should. So what you will need to do is just to type up here proof of facts, and what you see is it's coming here. And then once you click on American jurisprudence proof of facts, you can do your search. We'll talk a lot more about why proof of facts is worth all this time and effort a little bit later in the semester, but you may or may, depending on what the group finds, you may or may not see a little bit of that now. Okay, so that is a general search strategy. Start with secondary sources, then narrow as necessary. And pretty much the same thing works. It works the same way on Lexis, excuse me. So we're going to start secondary materials. Again, I could narrow if I want, but I'm suggesting a good strategy is to start general. I'm going to type in my search, driving. There we go. And here on Lexis, we start with a law review, and there's an ALR. So Lexis is kind of all over the place. Or journals. And similarly, you narrow on Lexis. Lexis, good place to start is by category. So AmJurs, not CJS. CJS you have to be on Westlaw, but AmJur and New York Jur, you can start with the jurisprudence. And ALR is also under jurisprudence. So category is probably a good place to start if you're on Lexis, and then you can narrow further by sources for a particular title of a source if you want to do that. Okay. So everybody good on how to find what they need. Start general, secondary sources generally, then narrow, review, then narrow as necessary. Yes. Mark. Okay. So to review briefly on Westlaw. So the first thing, again, you'll want to do secondary sources and try your search. Drunk driving. If you don't see it, scroll through and see if you see anything good. If you don't see New York Jur, which is definitely possible, then you'll want to look by publication name, and you should see it there. And if you're still having trouble, talk to me. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to take 10 minutes and to see what you can find for our client. So what are some of the terms we're going to search? You got to put finger to keyboard and type something. A little louder. I heard mumbling. Mumbling says, yeah. Is that it? Just anything about health maintenance organizations? So health maintenance organization, liability, denial of benefits. And if you don't get much from that, and I'm not saying you won't because I haven't done that search, so I don't know, what might you do? Anybody? If you get 0 results, what are you going to do? Okay, absolutely. What else? Could try malpractice. Just the word malpractice? Well, that is part of the facts, but remember we talked a little bit about research thinking and what terms do we want to research with. So if we put in cardiologist, do we then risk eliminating other good resources having to do with HMOs and liability? If you use the and phrase, that will tell Westlaw it has to have cardiologist. We'll be talking about connectors next week. I know there's another question about that. So just so whoever asked that knows, we'll be talking about connectors next week. By all means, try it this week. But we'll review that if you're a little fuzzy. So breach of contract. Another way, so HMO liability denial of treatment, leave off some terms. So definitely you try other terms. So these are all good alternate strategies. So I have now presented to you, and you all have presented to you, some possibilities on what you're going to type when you put finger to keyboard. And in your assigned resource, I'm going to ask you to find the best section if you can. If you can't decide between two are fine, okay. And then I also would like you to look at that resource and see if you can find any alternate other research references within that source. At the end of that, I'm going to ask one of you to come up and walk us through what your group did, and the rest of the group is going to help the person typing. So why don't we get started? And as I said, I'll give you about 10 minutes to do that. If you have questions, shout them out. Yeah.
So we're searching new jurisprudence on topic from last week.
Right. So remember.
Is there like a typed version of the facts?
Not a typed version of the facts, but actually let me. Okay, so we're going to see the ALR group and what they did. Thank you, Taylor, for volunteering.
Hello, guys.
Daniel, Nasha, you have to help out. So where do we start?
Well, we went into here first.
So you went to secondary sources first.
And then we went right to the American, to the ALR.
So you went straight to ALR. Okay. Again, as a general rule, I don't recommend that, but for purposes of this workshop, that's what I asked them to search, so that makes a lot of sense.
And then we did HMO liability.
Okay. So kept it simple.
And then we were kind of between the both of these because we were kind of a little bit confused on the fact pattern. So this one is this article is kind of does a good job at, the annotation collects and discusses reported cases which have considered whether a health maintenance organization can be held liable for the negligence of one of their member physicians.
Okay, stop there. Or is that our fact pattern? Are we trying?
Well, so that's what we were kind of a bit confused about, was whether or not that one would work, or would it be this one, which is the failure to authorize the required treatment by a third party.
Right. Third party healthcare payor.
Right.
Okay, so your group hit on a key distinction and key important component of doing research. Understand your facts. Not only get them straight, but understand your facts. So negligent. So is an HMO reliable for its negligence of member physician? So there really wasn't any physician in our case who was liable, right? Because our client never got to see the doctor.
Right. I guess we were confused as to the fact pattern.
Fair enough.
It would have been nice to have it kind of in front of us.
Okay. Yeah. Duly noted for future reference. I shall type it up and have it for you. No, that's an excellent suggestion. It's always the trade-off between killing more trees and having you have information in front of you. So that one I will definitely go with the having more information. So third-party healthcare payor. So that's the other thing, understanding what you're reading. So third-party healthcare payor. What is an HMO? It's essentially an insurance company that pays. So it is essentially the third-party healthcare payor. If you don't understand the language, either click in and see if it explains it for you, or jump out and do a quick research, Google what's third party. So let's take a look at this ALR, because this sounds pretty relevant now that we understand what third-party payor means, right? So So I actually have highlighted to illustrate to you why ALR can be so useful. So ordinarily, a patient alleging injury due to negligent health care brings a negligent suit directly against the medical practitioner or provider. In emergency system of managed care, however, where the third-party payor as part of its utilization review, we saw that last week in some of our searching, and cost-saving strategy refuses to authorize a particular treatment, and where the patient alleges that decision caused harm, the patient may bring action directly against the third-party payor for that pre-treatment denial, although it's likely that the patient will not prevail. So they're already explaining a little bit to us about what this whole if we had read that beginning, that would help explain what they are talking about. So this is one nice thing about ALR, is it explains up front what it's going to talk about. And then it goes on to say, I have highlighted here, applying both tort and contract principles. So again, giving us some ideas of how we might proceed if we are going to take this case on. ALR continues. So did any of you notice any good research resources before I go any further? I'll take that as a no. Okay, so the first good research resource is the table of contents within this particular article. So it's telling us, what are they going to talk about? So we've got this nice introduction. So liability. So for negligence, held liable, negligence not held liable. So ALR lays before us exactly what they're going to cover. Here we have preemption by federal law. Remember, we saw that in Google. We got to figure out this whole preemption thing and ERISA. And then it gives us research references. Another nice thing about ALR is it gives us this list of jurisdictions. So if we were lucky, which we're not in this case, we could go directly to our jurisdiction, but there is no New York State listed here, unfortunately. It only goes so far as Wisconsin. But we see some of that here. And again, the introduction is going to help explain. So if we weren't quite sure what this was about, we might want to look at the other article too, to look at that scope, the very first part, the introduction, to see what it is about and whether it's going to be useful for us. And here we discover very much that it is. And the other again, to reinforce why secondary sources are so useful, it starts to give us some of the terminology. So we ran across some of that utilization review, and here's managed care. So another term of art about HMO is one type of managed care delivery system. And it would discuss that here and tell you that. And it goes on to tell us number of actions originally brought in state court have been preempted by federal law, specifically by sections of ERISA, essentially. It contains a preemption clause, which provides that ERISA supersedes any and all state laws insofar as they may now or hereafter relate to any employee benefit plan. Okay, so again, explaining why we care about ERISA and the fact that what this preemption is and why it is we may need to start to look at it. Are we preempted? I mean, maybe we could still bring a case in federal court, but maybe we can't in state court. And we have that all-important research reference, that footnote, that is referring us to this section, 29 USCA 1144A. So again, we want to be taking notes, thinking, I got to check this out because this whole preemption thing, I don't know if it applies to us or not, but I got to figure that out. Because I got to know whether I can bring in state court or I have to bring in federal court, or I can't bring the claim at all. Okay, so ALR, we were able to find something that started to answer some of our questions. Of course, it gave us more questions to ask, but that's critical because we have to be able to answer all of those questions. Any questions from you? And as we also saw, if we scroll down, lots of references to cases. So again, someone had asked, how do you get good case law from secondary sources? Basically, that's one of the many great reasons to check secondary sources. It's going to give you references both to case law as well as to statutory law, as we saw with the USCA section I just highlighted. Okay, other thing we always need to be aware of is, again, one of our themes, being bibliographically aware. I want to know how up to date this is. It made some reference to the emerging system of managed healthcare. Managed healthcare has been around a long time. I don't know if anybody caught that. So I want to see how up to date this is. And on Westlaw, it will frequently tell us right up top, the AL databases are made current by the weekly edition of new relevant cases. So they're adding new relevant cases every week. It doesn't really tell us how up to date the article is. One would hope that if the article becomes totally out of date, they would either put something up there or, I don't know, they would remove it. But that essentially is what Westlaw is telling us. We can see it was originally published in 1998. That's why we saw that reference to emerging managed care system, which it is definitely no longer just emerging. Okay. Let's move on to AMGER. I have a volunteer. Excellent. Lexis or Westlaw? Westlaw. Okay, so I will bring us back. Actually, I need to ask you to use my laptop so that it's.
Use my laptop. Because I don't remember.
Okay.
There's a lot.
All right. So then.
I'm just gonna follow what I did and then put it on here. Okay. So first I went to secondary sources, and then I went straight to AMGER. So I clicked on that.
Again, totally fair enough, but general strategy, do your search first, look at your results.
Okay, so went straight to AMGER. And then within AMGER, we searched denial of benefits and negligence. Search. Okay, and then went through this. And then we saw this scope of ERISA's preemption provision. And that's kind of on point because we were talking about the possibility of our claim being preempted by ERISA. So kind of just scroll through this. There, found a case. Sorry, I'm just going to Control F here because it's in the middle. Grand Valley, okay. So this paragraph was talking about two-part test for determining when a state law claim falls within ERISA's civil enforcement provision and thus is completely preempted. So they're citing to a Michigan case. So I clicked on that case to see maybe we can find more authoritative sources pertaining to either New York or federal. So went through that opinion, and then from that opinion found a Supreme Court case called Davila, Aetna versus Davila. So they said the Supreme Court has held that ERISA is one such federal statute that wholly displaces state law claims and preempts state law causes of action. So just clicked on that to see what that was about. And then quickly read through the summary here.
Okay, so we found a Supreme Court case.
Yeah.
It seems like it's on point. Definitely want to make sure that you look
Yeah.
at that and read that carefully. The Michigan case obviously doesn't apply directly to New York, but
Right.
perfectly fine
To
in
find
terms
other sources.
exactly using it as
Yeah.
one of our clues to lead on to other sources.
So then went through the background here, and it was kind of a similar facts pattern. So there was a beneficiary under an employee benefit plan that sued their plan administrators in state court alleging they suffered injuries due to their decision not to provide coverage for treatment that was recommended by their physicians. So that's pretty much our exact fact pattern.
Sounds pretty relevant. So this Davila case sounds like it's pretty important.
And then there was like a test there. I don't know if I'm gonna go through that.
Okay,
but
actually,
yeah, it's a lot.
That's gonna stop here.
Okay.
So we have learned that looks like there's definite possibility of being preempted. What year was that Davila case? 2004. So, of course, does that mean we pack up everything and go home and tell our client, don't bother? No, we're lawyers. We're going to try to distinguish this, right? Or we're going to try to find alternate causes of action. Maybe we can't sue in state court. Maybe this means we just have to go to federal court. So there's just still a lot of questions out there. And we're not even sure, yes, this looks like it sounds just like our facts. But of course, again, we're lawyers. We're always trying to figure out how to distinguish. So we need to look at this more carefully and look at some of the subsequent case law, right? Because Davila was in 2004. It's a lot of years since. Okay, excellent. So Amjur in and of itself started with preemption. It didn't answer our questions regarding, didn't really answer any of the questions, but it got us going and helped us to track down an important Supreme Court case. Okay, CJS, which stands for Corpus Juris Secundum. Sorry I didn't tell you that earlier. So do I have a volunteer to come type? Okay, Lexis or Westlaw? Westlaw it is. So we saw some research references, right, in Amjur in terms of the state cases, like ALR. If you scroll down, you'll find other references to other types of resources, possibly other secondary sources as well as other primary sources, just as we saw with ALR.
So we were searching for HMO liability claims.
Start in secondary sources, good.
Yes.
So I'm curious what you'll get adding the word claims. Again, you want to think about your terminology carefully. I don't know that that's going to skew the different. Maybe that's one reason why you got different results. If someone else was just searching HMO liability.
Right. We were trying to search for, I think the phrasing was different because we were looking at it with different phrases. And then, but when we did this, we went to publication name on the bottom left side of the page. We had to find the corpus juris secundum, which is this. And,
Have to apply.
Yep.
Always messes me up on Westlaw.
there we go.
You have to choose it, then scroll back up, and then click on it a little bit more. Scroll back up a little bit more, and then click on apply. I always expect Westlaw just to do it, but it waits for me to click on apply.
So these were the results that came out. So preemption. So we saw sections here. This one's section 42, which is preemption. And then the site noted some statements. So here, wait, is it? I feel like I saw something different on my search because I was searching for HMO liability. Oh, I was searching for HMO malpractice claims, so that's why it was different. So it was section 195, which indicated the parties, but this one, it's preemption. That's why it's different. But yeah, generally, I mean that's what you get, I think.
Okay, so couple of items I want to highlight, and this would also be true looking at what we just did at AmJur. Again, the all-important bibliographic awareness, looking up top, Corpus Juris Secundum, September 2019 update. I suspect if we had looked at AmJur, it would be quite similar. And the other aspect of all of these secondary resources, at some point, they will give you references. You'll see links at different points. You could just scroll down. And they'll give you research references. So there's not so many, just an ALR index reference. AmJur would do the same, ALR would do the same. Just a function of looking for those references. And sometimes those references can point you to something more on point than what you're looking at. So again, the idea of bibliographic awareness and being aware of what a source can do to help you out. Okay, now go to our proof of facts group. Okay, Westlaw?
This is being recorded, right?
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, is this the camera? Or is it somewhere else? I don't want to get too close.
It's not recording you, it's just recording what's on my screen. You want a cameo appearance?
We did the proof of facts, which was only on Westlaw, right?
Correct.
I think I'm gonna have to type it in. Well, okay, so I'm all the way at the
So
beginning.
proof of facts is a little tricky. Westlaw doesn't put it in the list when you in the filtering list when you narrow.
Right. So, maybe I think we just typed in proof of, and then so if you see one of the suggestions is right there. So we clicked on that. And then we did our key terms. We did like two different phrases. Both gave us the source that we ultimately thought was most pertinent. So I'll just type in ERISA and HMO. So our first was HMO and liability, but again, either results should result in the same thing. Okay, so this was liability of health maintenance organizations. I mean, that sort of popped out as being very pertinent. And then it's a very long document, but we perused it and we found section 15. Like while we were perusing it, we saw something that said elements, right? So I went there, elements of proof of liability of an HMO, right? Bingo. Like literally gives us a checklist of the different things. And then we thought maybe the best one that we could go after was denial of treatment was proximate cause of injury. So if you click that, it says section 7 and 25. So we thought section 7 was the best. I should have just done that. Okay.
So this was the best result in proof of facts. I wasn't really asking you to pinpoint the exact section, although that's great that you found a useful one. So it sounds like proof of facts was very useful.
Yeah. So then, we can get into the weeds, but this says direct negligence and then just provides a nice summary with citations to a bit of case law about in what circumstances can you hold the HMO liable. One was like the HMO gave a patient a doctor that had too many patients, right? So I guess he wasn't able to give her or her child like the time of day. So it was just sort of a negligent caretaking, I guess. And then you go after the HMO, but.
So it's giving you some examples of when we can find an HMO liable. And again, you'd want to look at those cases, especially now that we learned about the Davila case. You'd want to look at those cases and see did they come before or after to see if they help distinguish. And scrolling back up to the top, again, just looking at our update. So American jurisprudence proof of facts is related to American jurisprudence, obviously, because of the name. It's a particular set that does what the title says. It lays out how you would prove your particular case. This is one type of practitioner material that we will be coming back to in depth when we talk about practitioner materials later in the semester. So last but definitely not least, our New York jurisprudence group. We have a volunteer for typing. Excellent, Marlon. Thank you. And Westlaw, right?
Yeah.
I will let Marlon do his thing and then we can talk further.
Okay, so we put HMO.
Did you narrow the secondary sources first?
I did it after.
You did it?
Yeah.
Okay. So doing it before and after might cause you to have slightly different results. I know there's a group there talking about how Westlaw always brings something different. So that's one reason. It's really okay to do it either way. I suggest doing it first just because if you do it after, you just get a whole lot of stuff that looks overwhelming and confusing. And if you know you want to look at secondary sources, then might as well just do it first. There's also, depending on your plan, again, depending on your contract at your organization, it may be less expensive to narrow to secondary sources first. So that's another reason, if you know you want secondary sources, to narrow first.
Okay, well.
But it's definitely not wrong.
So then we scroll down to New York jurisprudence.
And you got to scroll up and apply. Again, I always get caught on that in Westlaw, so or down. You can actually do it, scroll down and click apply too. I think I'm used to Amazon where you just do your filter and boom, it does it.
I'm in different search results than what I had.
Yes, you are. Okay.
I'm not sure why.
Do HMO liability denial of coverage? Is that your full? No, I saw you had different results.
I also put New York in the state, so on the right side.
Okay, so let's go back. HMO denial. So yeah,
Here we changed this.
yeah, well, that would only narrow it further. So let's actually, oops. So let's just, come on.
I think you have to close that.
So I narrowed first. I mean, I know you said you did it. I just want to see if we can get you. So I don't know what's going on here.
I don't know if that somehow.
So,
I also got the same with denial of claims.
I'm really not sure. I would have to go back and why this is doing this. Shouldn't make a difference. Okay, so let's try one because I saw what you.
I had 6 results.
Yeah, so I know that's not what you typed in. Just trying to pull up your results, and we will have to ask everybody to give us the benefit of the doubt that we really did find this in your results, and it would just take too much class time for me to figure out why you're not finding it this time. Yeah, so there's 8 results now. So I did see, and I think that's okay. So I did see I promise you, I did see on Merlin's computer that he found this section with whatever he had searched before. Again, I'd have to watch the whole process and figure out it's not worth everybody's time. So you found, I think it was that second one?
Yeah, but there was another one. But so yeah, we found this, and talks generally about liability, and the observation was really helpful. Because it also talks about liability. But then I scrolled down, and I think this headnote right here kind of really spoke to how under this provision you can bring a cause of action for medical malpractice directly towards an HMO. So then we went to that.
So that's Public Health Law 4401, I think that is, or 4410, I'm sorry, 4410. Public Health Law is one of the statutory codes in New York. So we found a reference to a primary source in New York.
And then also within that same headnote, there was a case. So we just kind of glanced over that as well, just to see like if the facts matched, or read the headnotes too, and just kind of expanded on our understanding of the issue and how maybe the issue might relate to ours.
Excellent. So thank you for your patience in figuring this out. Okay, so we also, Merle and I had a very interesting conversation in looking at the New York jurissection 115 that he had found, because I think at first glance it didn't look all that relevant, because it talked about vicarious liability, which we're not talking about. But it took a little bit of reading and a little bit of reading outside of what Westlaw highlights. So what Westlaw does is it takes our terms and decides which section it thinks is the best, which sometimes is really great, but sometimes is a little bit misleading, because this section starts with, this provision does not bar or preclude health maintenance organization from being held vicariously liable. And not surprisingly, Marlon thought, wait a minute, this isn't our issue. Marlon is absolutely right about that. But again, don't get fooled just because Westlaw guessed wrong. Again, that AI, artificial intelligence, sometimes is pretty intelligent and sometimes not so much. We still have the edge on artificial intelligence. So read the entire section, because as we saw, as Marlon so pointed out so well, it gave us references to New York law that could be very useful. With those wonderful references. So again, looking on Westlaw, we see relatively up-to-date, November 2019. Marlon also mentioned another interesting strategy, and that is he narrowed to New York first. I would suggest that, especially starting out with secondary sources, unless someone's telling you go to New York jurisprudence, don't narrow quite yet. Because if you had narrowed to New York and I had just asked everybody to do my recommended strategy, not asking you to look at a particular resource, if you had done your search, and let's go back here and cleared our filters. So if you've done whatever your search was, let's stick with my example, HMO liability, you may or may not have come across this wonderful Amjur proof of facts, which we saw was really useful. If you had narrowed to New York first, you probably would not have gotten that. Now, if you know you just want to look at New York law, then by all means, narrow to your jurisdiction. But just starting out in secondary sources, again, I recommend not doing that. I also, as I said, recommend narrow to secondary, do your search, look through your results. Again, this workshop was not your standard strategy, because each one of you have some up close and personal experience with one of our resources. A general rule on strategy, do your search, see what you can find that's useful. So we saw that proof of facts. Here's another one scrolling down, causes of action against a health maintenance organization under state tort law. Again, that could be really useful. That's from a set called Causes of Actions, very similar to proof of facts. And other sources as well. Okay, I'm going to briefly show a couple of these sources on Lexis, so you know how that looks, because you want to be familiar with both, again, in case you're working at a organization that only has Lexis. Again, I would recommend going to secondary materials first, not narrowing by jurisdiction, and doing whatever search to determine what you want to do. So on Lexis, we want to narrow by category, and I'm going to go to jurisprudence because that's where Lexis puts. So here's ALR, and here's the ALR actually that our ALR group found. And again, our updating, it's the one thing I wanted to highlight on Lexis, you tend to find on top. You also, Lexis will very frequently on the right have this source information. So that's another place to find how up to date the source is. And it takes a second to come up. Tells us not very much detail, but that's what Lexis, that's the information Lexis provides for us. So that is another good way to find how up to date Lexis will be. You see, will pretty much work for Amger on Lexis. It will look the same. As I mentioned, CJS and proof of facts not available on Lexis, and actually New York jurisprudence, it would work the same way. Okay, any questions regarding these basic secondary sources? Again, several of you in the screencast asked about, do we have to start encyclopedias? Or you got a little bit fooled by that question because you missed, and the answer is, it's not I definitely wouldn't say always start in encyclopedias by all means, but really the rule of thumb is you start with whatever sounds like it's going to not answer your question. You start with whatever is going to help get you more knowledgeable about your issue, whatever's going to improve your understanding, whether it's proof of facts, whether it's a treatise, whether it's a law review. That's why I say search secondary materials first, look at your results and figure out what sounds relevant. Now in my results, if we go back to my results here on Westlaw, there were a few we found proof of facts sounded relevant, that cause of action sounded relevant, but not much else. So I might say, okay, I found a couple there. I'm definitely going to look at those. But let me narrow and see if there's any good ALR, because if I do find a great one like our group did, I want to know about it because it really helped my understanding a lot. I may also want to narrow by New York jurisprudence because I definitely have to find out about New York law eventually. So those are examples of why you might want to narrow after reviewing your main results. Any question about that strategy? Okay. So one other strategy within your resources that you definitely want to know about. Let's see where I can find our results here. Okay. Oops, actually, you know what? I want to go back there first. In looking at my results, so I'm looking at the New York juror results, but this is true for any of your results, is not only am I going to look at the source, but I'm going to look at the context of this section. So by that, I mean, what are they telling me about this Section 115 Health Maintenance Organization? It's telling me here, well, it's a New York jurisprudence. We already figured that out. But it's telling me it's in the malpractice area. So that's telling me, okay, it's in that area. That's going to be interesting. So this one too, this is malpractice. This is just generally the section. So I still might look at that, but I know that that might be of interest. Some of our other results may have told us it's in, there was one search I did where it told me it was in the, forgive me, it's not very cheerful, but in the death section. And of course, thankfully, that's not our issue for our client, or thankfully, especially for our client. So I would know if I saw death here, that's not my issue. That's not what I need to learn more about. So I'm probably not going to look at that. So then going into, and this is a related concept, and I'm going to be talking a lot about this throughout the semester. Going into this section, I'm going to look at this heading information, and it's pretty much telling me what I already talked about, that it's in the malpractice by healthcare providers. But I'm going to look at the table of contents. And table of contents, as I think I mentioned in the screencast, is an, to me, unbelievably unappreciated resource for research. It just can tell you and teach you so much. So within our table of contents, we're looking at malpractice. We're looking at who may be held liable for malpractice, particular healthcare providers. So I'm going to look at my table of contents and see, are there any other sections that might be useful? I found 115. Maybe there are other ones around 115 that are useful. So I look at who may be held for, and our table of contents here on the left on Westlaw, who may be held liable for malpractice. And as I scroll down, there's veterinarians, nurses, hospitals, charitable, and then finally health maintenance organizations here at the bottom on section 115. So here's an example where we looked at the table of contents, didn't find anything else, but we will see an example shortly where the table of contents is key to helping us find useful sections to help improve our understanding. And it looks slightly different on Lexis. If we were to go, say, to New York Juror, I'm going to get out of ALR here. And let's go to source. And let's go to New York Juror. I hope. Oh, there it is. Yay. See, Lexis does it automatically. So here's our very same section, and just the table of contents is just over here. As you can see, our source information to find out the updating information is available here on the right. So again, I can do that analysis to see if there are other sections within my area. I can also click on the heading information, which I could do on Westlaw as well. Okay, any questions on these sources? Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break and come back, and we will talk about other types of secondary sources. So I'll see you back at 5:40. Couple of wrap-up items, and then we will indeed move on. And one of the wrap-up items is back here on New York jurisprudence on Westlaw. In addition to the table of contents, you also want to be aware when it's available of the index, because the index can be very useful, and we'll see an example of an index, using an index in just a little while. Typically on Westlaw, to get to the index, you want to get to the table of contents. So I just clicked on View Full Table of Contents, and scrolling up, it shows me a link to the index. I could also get there just by typing in the title, New York jurisprudence, and it would bring me to the, so if I knew I wanted to get directly there, you can see under the content pages. And again, you see that same page with the index. Other wrap up I wanted to do for encyclopedia is one of our screencast questions. Somebody asked whether there were available online for free any legal encyclopedias. Of course, you could use Wikipedia and any number of encyclopedias that you can find through Google. The answer is not really. There is, the closest answer I can come is a legal encyclopedia, but it's designed for the general public, not for lawyers, and it's at the Legal Information Institute. And we will actually be looking at the LII, Legal Information Institute, a little bit when we talk about primary sources, but there they do have some legal information for the public, and that's really the closest I can think of in terms of free legal encyclopedias. So we've looked at encyclopedias, we've looked at ALR, again related. let's talk a little bit now about current awareness. Current awareness is essentially, again, librarianese lingo for sources that are telling you what's new in a particular area of law or what's going on currently. What are the new developments? Current awareness is a source that you'll actually, or a type of source, excuse me, that you'll want to check a couple of times throughout the process, because it might be a good place to, if not initially start at, but take a look at early, depending again on your area of law, to get a sense, is this area changing? Is there anything new I should really know about? Another reason you might want to look at a particular area of law, current awareness source starting out, is if it's a particularly, I want to say hot area of law, but much talked about area of law. So I have an example of here, state and local tax deduction. Sometimes it's good just to check general interest news sources. So I also plugged in Wall Street Journal. You don't have to specify. Again, it depends on your issue. I didn't plug in our ERISA question or HMO liability because that's probably not something that's going to appear in general interest newspapers. I mean, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, whatever it is you read, however, in whatever format. But the SALT deduction is something that's talked about a lot in the newspapers because it's of political interest. So if you know that your issue is something that's talked a lot about in the news, that might be a good place to look because it'll give you a little bit of background, let you know what's going on, what some of the current issues are. So here's an example where I can find out the House is voting to repeal, just what's going on in the Congress, what's going on in various state legislatures, again, because that is relevant to this particular issue. So that's one type of current awareness source, just a general interest newspaper. There are also legal news sources, and these again are very much worth looking at starting out in your research again to see if there are current developments. And the handout, one of the handouts that went around, the colorful one, are different sources of legal news. And these days, what a lot of lawyers do is they basically register for a particular legal news alert. So for instance, those of you who are staying in New York, you will almost certainly want to be reading the New York Law Journal. And by reading the New York Law Journal, I mean signing up for their alerts. I get the daily alerts of the email alerts of the New York Law Journal, and I just scan through those alerts to see if there's anything of interest happening that particular day. You can also look at it online through their umbrella site called law.com. So let's take a quick look at law.com. And to look at law.com, we need to first go to the library homepage. So I'm going to have to open up the library homepage. To get to this, if you don't already have a bookmark the way I do, just Google Hofstra Law Library. It's really the easiest way. And from here, I'm going to go to a link called Online Resources right up top. And then, because I already know I want law.com, just follow the alphabet. And there's law.com. And the reason I'm going through the Law Library homepage and not just typing in law.com is because of this screen. This is an authentication screen. Have any of you run across this before? Some of you have for Hein Online. What did you? Hein Online. Oh, right, the West Study Guides you have to. So basically, any database that we, the Law Library, Hofstra Law School, subscribes to, if we want to give you access, remote access, or sometimes even laptop access here on campus, we have to authenticate. Basically, we have to tell the West Study Guides, or we have to tell law.com, we subscribe. We pay you lots of money to access this site. I am a legitimate Hofstra person accessing this. So going through this site is how we communicate to law.com, to West Study Aids. We'll be looking at Hein Online. Law 360 is another site I'll talk about briefly. So I log in when I see this screen and I see that blue easy proxy. I log in with my portal credentials. So it should be pretty straightforward. So if you're following along on your laptops, you will reach the screen. You will put in your portal credentials. Cross my fingers that the technology works, and voila. Now you could get to this site without doing that, but if you want to actually read the articles, then you would need to do that. And if you did not go through the library first, you'd have to backtrack and go through in order to get to that easy proxy authentication screen. So it's a little bit of tech weeds there for you, but they're important weeds to get through because if you want to access the site, that's how you have to do it. So now that we are here, I can look. So law.com is the umbrella site. Law.com covers a whole bunch of different legal news sites. So if we look at this publications, we see the American Lawyer. That's a very popular national law news source. We see New York Law Journal, Legal Intelligencer. I think one of you said you might go to New Jersey. So there's the New Jersey Law Journal. The Connecticut Law Journal's in there. I think Texas may be in there. So a bunch of different legal news sites. And again, probably wherever you wind up, you will want to find out what the standard legal news site is for your state and start to get those alerts and follow it. And very likely your organization will subscribe because it's just a standard resource to follow what's going on in whatever practice area you are. Like I said, I don't even practice, and I follow the New York Law Journal just to find out what's going on. So if we go to the New York Law Journal, it actually doesn't look a whole lot different. So there's New York Law Journal, so we can find out what's going on in New York. And I got alert with these headlines about what's going on. I can search the site. To see if there's anything going on with our particular, and it's kind of funky because it brings you to this screen, but I can see, okay, is anything going on these days with ERISA preemption? I don't know for a fact there is or isn't, so this is how I would find out. So what I'm actually seeing here, not so much news articles. The other thing the New York Law Journal does, and we'll go into more detail about this when we talk about cases, is the New York Law Journal presents to us cases that are recently decided in New York, some of which will be reported in the standard case reports, but many of which will never get reported. And lawyers love to go to the New York Law Journal when they're not finding reported cases to see if they can find an unreported case that's going to be with their facts on their issue. Just like you all were looking for those cases as you're looking through the secondary sources to find case that has your facts. It's what lawyers are doing. That's what you're training to do. And sometimes if it's not reported, they might go to the New York Law Journal for unreported. And again, I'll go into a lot more detail about reported versus unreported when we talk about opinions and case law. But this is what the New York Law Journal looks like, and it gives us both those news stories as well as the cases. Another site, again on the handout, is that Law 360 I mentioned. That's also a news source. So again, we would go through it the same way. Online resources, I would go. So there are these various publishers and they do different things. So Law 360 is not so much state specific, but again, it's more topic oriented, although New York, the law.com also has its topics as well. The whole authentication thing works for Law 360 as well. I should also mention both Law 360 and law.com, well, the New York Law Journal, are available on Lexis. If they are not in your plan, they're going to be very expensive not for you now, but for your organizations, wherever you wind up working, on Lexis. What the New York Law Journal does is after a certain point, it no longer is available on the web through the law.com site we were at. It dumps it all over to Lexis, and you have to have access to Lexis in order to search the archives, in order to search all the back files. But Lexis, if you have access to Lexis, is a great way to search for the New York Law Journal, because sometimes the search on law.com isn't that easy to use. Okay, so I'll show you how that works briefly. And again, one of you, a couple of you, I think, asked in the screencast, is there a reason why you might prefer one service over the other? So Lexis over Westlaw. And it's not so much one is better, but Lexis is where you're going to find the New York Law Journal and some of these other law.com sites. You won't find it on Westlaw just because that's the contract that this law.com made. They decided they're just going to go with Lexis. So here on Lexis, what you might want to do, if you know you definitely just want the New York Law Journal, you can type it up here and find it this way, the way we've been doing with other titles, or you can go here to legal news. Sometimes this is a good way to look for some legal, again, that current awareness, what's going on now in your particular area. So you can see here, ALM, by the way, is the name of the company that owns law.com, which you would have no way of knowing unless I told you. I wouldn't worry about keeping track of all of that. You do see Law 360 here. I mentioned ALM just in case you're wondering, why am I not seeing law.com? The reason you're not seeing law.com is it's an ALM. But if you did your search here within the legal news, you would get results from New York Law Journal and the other ALMlaw.com titles, publications, and lots of other publications as well. And you can always limit. Now, when I say limit, what I really should be saying is filtering. So this is some terminology we should all get used to using together so you understand what I'm referring to. So when I'm telling you to filter, I'm telling you to go to the side here and narrow or limit your search. Anybody here shop on Amazon? Same exact concept. You do your Amazon search, and then you might want to filter on the side by price or whatever other categories you have on the side. Same exact concept on both Lexis and Westlaw. So we might want to search, filter, I'm going to use the right terminology now, filter by sources. So here I could filter by the New York Law Journal. I don't see, there's Law 360. So those are just the two I've been mentioning, but there are other sources as well here on the Lexis Legal News. Any question about current awareness sources? So we've got Legal News, New York Law Journal, other states' publications. We've got Law 360, a little bit more national. So the other source I'm going to show you, which we haven't looked at yet, and this was one of the requests on the screencast, was to get to know Bloomberg a little bit more. So Bloomberg's interesting. Bloomberg's the new guy on the block. By new guy, as compared to Lexis and Westlaw, Bloomberg's been around maybe 5 years. Don't quote me on the exact number. It's not important. But a lot less time than Lexis that started back in the 70s and Westlaw that started in the 80s. And I'm talking 1970s and 80s. Bloomberg's pretty new. And Bloomberg, I think, has been trying to figure out where its niche it's going to be. Because Lexis and Westlaw do pretty well, right? Everybody knows it, are comfortable with it, and it's hard to break into a market. So I think, and this is just Lisa's theory, so don't take this as absolute gospel by any means. I think Bloomberg is beginning to target more toward experienced attorneys and certainly more in the transactional areas. Part of that makes a little bit of intuitive sense, right? Because Bloomberg got its start as a business resource. I don't know if any of you have seen those Bloomberg terminals, the kind of big things with those like teeny little, I don't know much about intense stock trading, but that's essentially what investment bankers and stock traders use as the Bloomberg terminals. So Bloomberg Law got started, and they very much have those business resources. So I think my theory, again, is that's where Bloomberg Law is going, is that it's going to gear itself toward more the business transactional side of the legal practice. What Bloomberg Law recently did, like a year or two ago, is purchase another legal publishing company called BNA. So these days you might see Bloomberg BNA, and that's all that means. BNA was a very well-respected, long-established publishing company of current awareness sources. What BNA used to do in the really old days is send out good old-fashioned paper newsletters on particular topics. So there was the BNA Law Report. If you're in, I think a couple of you said you were interested in tax. BNA was huge in tax. So there was the daily tax report. Securities was another big area for BNA. Labor, securities, tax. They got into some internet law. So they had an internet law reporter. So they did a lot of these weekly newsletters. And of course, when they went online, they turned daily because, of course, they could update it more frequently online. Bloomberg bought that out and is currently incorporating BNA. And this is a work in progress. So last year, I showed the advanced legal research class the BNA website. I no longer do that because it no longer exists. It's all been folded in to Bloomberg, and I think Bloomberg is trying to figure out how to make the people who were used to it the old way happy, because it looks much different now than it did in the old days. And I know from what I've heard, there are a lot of older attorneys, and by older, I mean not that old, like 10 years older than you all, who got used to using the BNA online, but separately, it just doesn't function the same. So we'll see what happens with Bloomberg. The point of all of this is that this is changing, right? So what I'm going to show you on Bloomberg today may look different possibly tomorrow, possibly next year, almost certainly 3 or 5 years from now. But let's see what it looks like today and what it can do for you. So what I find the best way to use Bloomberg is to a couple of different ways. To use the browse menu, so what's sometimes referred to as the hamburger menu. Here on the left, it says browse, so it's pretty straightforward. And at least for current awareness, so what I'm talking about, we've got news and analysis. And you see that there are 3 different categories. There's Bloomberg Law Analysis, News, and News from Bloomberg Terminal. So let's just take a real quick look at all of them. So Law Analysis, it's got, as it sounds, a little bit more in depth, a lot of different topics here. So real estate, SEC investment, can Delaware can't, so business, as you can see, this is gig driver class action, so a little bit of the gig economy, and employment law. So that's law analysis. The law news is going to be a bit briefer, just top stories, what's going on. So Supreme Court declines to rush review of Obamacare appeal. Oh, didn't know that. Okay, so again, top stories, but top stories from a business law angle to a large degree. And then Bloomberg News Terminal, I think, is going to be less legal related. Why isn't that? There we go. So here we just have general news. So it's, of course, talking about the latest news from Congress, and here's some legal. So that's one way to navigate Bloomberg. Another way to navigate Bloomberg, if I could get back to all content, are through these practice centers. And again, I think that's where their focus is, to take more experienced attorneys who know where their practice areas are and to have them work through that. There are advantages and disadvantages. So for instance, one of the disadvantages for our client, for our issue, is it a health law issue? Is it labor and employment, because we're talking about health benefits, and that's through employment? Or is it a benefits issue? Because again, we're talking about employment benefits. I don't know the answer to that. So either you try one of each, or you do a general search. But let's take a quick look at the Practice Center so you get a sense of what it can do for you, even if you don't quite know the answer to that. And it gives you these practical guidance suites so you can navigate your way through. So interesting analytics, so some data because of the Bloomberg terminal and what Bloomberg did so well starting out and how Michael Bloomberg made all his money was developing this data analysis for business people. So there's going to be a lot of data analysis tools. And so we can see these area-specific practice centers pull together some of these materials. You'll see these portfolios. That was a BNA. Remember, I mentioned BNA is that company. In addition to their weekly newsletters, they develop these portfolios, which, again, tax especially. If you found a tax portfolio, it just really explained things soup to nuts for you in that particular area of tax law. This is an area, current awareness, where Bloomberg, I think, excels. It's on that handout I sent around, and here are some of those areas in Bloomberg that I'm highlighting for you, the areas of Bloomberg with those current awareness sources. Okay, other current awareness sources for free now. I'm actually glad that one of you asked that free question about free encyclopedias because you're thinking about costs and how to save costs. So one area is back here in Google, I did a search, ERISA law research. One really great resource that's available for free are research guides. And yes, I am very biased because these legal research guides are very frequently prepared by law librarians. So truth in advertising there, I am biased. And they are, I think, usually pretty reliable because they're produced through law librarians, not always, but frequently at the various law schools across the country. So I will show you ours in just a couple of minutes, but in our ERISA law search example, we can see one here at uc.edu. Actually, this link is specific to treatises, which we'll be talking about in just a little bit. But here's the overall ERISA research guide to basically ERISA research and guide. And you see it's a guide broken up, general sources. It gives you statutory, administrative, case law, treatises, that link we just saw, articles. So sources on doing ERISA law research. So right here, if I know I have an ERISA issue, I'm getting a guide on the different resources for research. And this particular guide's at the University of Cincinnati Law Library. I just picked that as one link. Scrolling down, there's another one here at Georgetown. Here's another one, ERISA primary law. So this is at the John Marshall Law School. And again, I went directly into primary law, but now you can see these tabs, general, and they all kind of look similar. These research guides. A lot of law schools use a similar system called LibGuides. You don't have to know that. I'm just telling you why they look the same. We do here at Hofstra as well. Show you ours. So back here, I'm just going back to the Law Library homepage. And remember, we saw online resources to get to law.com and to Law 360. Right here, just to the left, library guides. Here's our listing of library guides. And we'll actually be coming back to this list in just a little while. We don't have one on ERISA, however. And last aspect of current awareness, you could try, a lot of people keep blogs. Lawyers keep blogs. It's a way of communicating. It's a way scholars communicate online to some extent. You can see if there are any good blogs out there. And it's just very simplistic. Again, good old Google, ERISA law blogs. Again, if you wanted to see what's out there in ERISA. So these strategies, looking for blogs, looking for research guides, are good when you understand what it is you need to know more about. So when we first started our exploration of our issue for our client, we didn't know ERISA was even a thing. So this probably isn't the best first place to start, because you have to know, again, what kind of research guide to look for, or what kind of blog to look for. But once you have a sense of, ooh, I have this legal question about ERISA, I could look for a research guide, or I could look for a blog. Again, the blogs are going to be by attorneys, so just keep that in mind to think about whether they're trying to convince you to hire them, because a lot of times that's why attorneys put up information on the web, but not always. Any questions? Okay, enough of me talking for sure. Time to do another workshop. We already did our first one with regard to the encyclopedias, where I had you all come up. This second one for today, I know it says part 1. I probably should make that part 2. But anyway, so we'll talk about, this is for current awareness. So I'm going to ask you to take about 10 minutes now. I don't know if I passed around enough, so I'll pass around a few more. I'm going to ask you to take a good number of you were aware that there are advanced Google search techniques. So I promised the rest of you I would show you, and those of you who do know about it, maybe this is not one you're familiar with. So I had done a Google search on ERISA law research, and we looked at some of the library guides. But another result that came up, we see here, is dol.gov, and we can see here from the title, DOL's Department of Labor. Again, as I mentioned with the NIH.gov site, you see a governmental site. It's worth looking at, get a sense if they're giving you any guidance. I'll talk more about guidance later on in the semester. But here came up with this is a result at from the Department of Labor from my ERISA law research, and it gives me some background about ERISA, which may or may not be interesting. But I might think to myself, Department of Labor, health benefits through employer, the DOL site might have some interesting information for me, but I don't want to just look at this site from my own Google search. And I don't want to just search Google generally, because I'll get sites all over the place. I want to search the Department of Labor site. Well, this advanced Google search technique will allow me to decide I want to search just a particular portion of the web, or a particular website. And the way I do that, up here in the web address bar, I get my cursor to the very beginning. I type the word site, S-I-T-E, and then colon. I've got no spaces. Now I want to search just anywhere in the Department of Labor website. I don't want to even necessarily just search the topic health plans ERISA that we see here. So I'm going to delete back to the general part of the site, so dol.gov, space, and I want to search that for, well, let's try preemption. Preemption. And what this will do, I'm just going to double check. Instead of preemption, I want to go, so remember, I'm changing my mind here. I want to see if they mention anything just about HMOs and HMO denying treatment. I don't want to get even as specific as preemption. I could try preemption also. This is just an example. So again, site colon, just the portion of the website I want to search, so the general dol.gov, and then whatever my search terms are, preemption, HMO denial. And what Google is doing is it's narrowing its Googleness to just the dol.gov, just the part that I have in there, dol.gov. And I can choose anything up here. I could delete back as much as I want or as little as I want. So now I am searching just dol.gov for HMO denial. So full report, and you can see I got quite a lot of results all over the place. Full report, Department of Labor, obviously have to read that to see if it's useful. Health benefits coverage under federal law. here is something about ERISA. I can see here ERISA preemption, so didn't even use those search terms. This advanced Google search is something I use constantly. It is extraordinarily useful. Sometimes sites will have their own search capability, and that's fine too, although sometimes they're not so great. So even in that case, I'll just take the website, whatever portion of it I think is what's of interest, do the site colon of the portion of the website address that I want, space, and then my search terms. And I use this for all sorts of different reasons. So it really allows me to use the power of Google, but not get the overwhelming Google universe results, really to narrow my results to a particular website. So that's what I was referring to in the workshop under the optional question 4. If you're searching for blogs, you can actually search a particular blog, either using their search tool or using this site search for that blog. But I won't ask you to go back and do that. Just wanted to make sure I mentioned the advanced Google search, and we'll be talking about that again. Any questions? So now I'm going to move on to treatises. The other screencast that you looked at, and a couple of the questions I had to do with when they are persuasive and why are they persuasive, and for judges. And essentially, judges will look to what experts say, again, say Nimmer on copyright. So a judge might look to say, what does Nimmer say on this particular aspect of, fair use law, to bring up a copyright? And a judge certainly isn't bound by what Nimmer says on copyright, but because Nimmer is a very well-respected expert, the judge might say, okay, so that informs me. The judge may or may not be persuaded by what Nimmer suggests should be the law on fair use. But because of the respect Nimmer has, the judge might find that persuasive. So that's the why judges might be persuaded by treatises specifically. Judges sometimes may cite to law review articles for the same reason. They're certainly not bound to follow a law review article, but they might find the reasoning persuasive and cite to it. How you can find it, we'll be looking at something called citing resources on Westlaw and shepherdizing on Lexis. So that's the short answer to that question. Another way to find if judges cite to a particular article is just to search in cases for the title of that article or the title of the treatise. But I will show you citing resources and citing and shepherdizing when we look at law reviews next week. For now, we will focus on treatises. Somebody asked about judging the credibility of the treatises. The nice thing about Lexis and Westlaw is that they are respected legal research resources. So pretty much the treatises that you find on Lexis and Westlaw, you can rely on. That's the difference between Lexis and Westlaw and Google. Anybody can put up anything on the web. I could put up something on the web and I could say the world's foremost expert on cats. And yeah, my cat pin, so I can claim that I'm the world's foremost expert on cats now, right? And if you make the mistake of believing me, because it's on Google, I can put it there. I could not get the world's foremost expert on cat law put up on Lexis and Westlaw, not without getting published and vetted. So that's kind of the short and somewhat silly answer as to how can you tell if a treatise can be relied on. Again, Lexis and Westlaw. And likewise, many of the treatises in the library, I say with the exception only that in print treatises, as well as Lexis and Westlaw, and we'll be talking a lot about this in just a second, is just be aware of how up to date they are, especially print in the library. We've got some really old stuff. Not that you should never look at old stuff, but again, you should be bibliographically aware to know this treatise is from 1930. Maybe I don't want to rely on it for current law. And yes, we do have treatises from 1930 in print in a law library. You probably won't find them on Lexis or Westlaw. So that would be the exception to that. Basically, why people pay so much money is that for Lexis and Westlaws, they're pre-vetted, and likewise, libraries make some decisions about what they're going to spend their money on. That's a little less reliable, honestly, even though I'm a librarian. At some level, you just have to use your own judgment. Okay. I'll be talking about finding treatises in a moment, and someone asked about searching by keyword. We'll be doing that next week, so I just want to let you know that question will be answered, but not till next week. Okay, so let's dive into treatises at long last. How to find treatises? Anybody remember from the screencast what were some of my suggestions? Here to find treatises, which is why I ask. Well, we already saw one example looking at encyclopedias and looking at ALR. Catalogs is one way, yeah. In ALR and encyclopedias, there are those research references. Sometimes those research references will refer us to some really good treatises. Not always, but that's another source. Okay, another answer to that question is standing in front of you. Librarian. Or as I like to say, maybe not standing in front of you, your favorite reference librarian. So yeah, absolutely. Again, treatises can be difficult to find. We have been doing this, some of us, for a very long time, so I know NIMR on copyright is the place to go, just because I have been in the business a long time. So librarians in your organizations, especially as they work with the same attorneys who are subject specialist attorneys, their attorneys will have their favorite treatises. So that's another resource that actually I should have mentioned in the screencast, and that's your supervisor. Your supervisor may be an expert in tax law, and she will refer you to the standard federal tax reporter or whatever her favorite is. Likewise, other areas of the law. Okay, so that's a little bit on how to find other ways to find we just talked about, and those are those research guides. If you remember, let's go back to, actually that was my, so here's my ERISA law research, and we took a look at the University of Cincinnati research guide. And there's a whole section on treatises. So here's a whole list of ERISA treatises. So I did ERISA law research, and I found a research guide, and I looked at treatises. Excellent way. These are people who, again, librarians who know a little bit about the area, so they're only going to recommend good ones. So here at Hofstra, and I'll be asking you to look at this in just a little while, not our catalog. Let's get to, okay, I'm just going to go back to the Law Library homepage and our library guides. And in our library guides, we have recommended legal treatises. The reason this is useful for you at this juncture, in addition to my asking you to look at it for our next workshop, is that this is going to list treatises here at Hofstra. Some on Lexis and Westlaw, some in print. And you can see by subject. So if you are interested in evidence, here are treatises regarding evidence. Actually, if I scroll down to the evidence subject, we'll see them. Again, some in print, some online. These, yeah, here, this one says available on Westlaw. So this one's both in print and online. Okay, so that's how we find treatises. How to other ways to find treatises. Let's go to Lexis and Westlaw. As I mentioned, they're pre-vetted. So I will start here on Lexis for no particular reason other than I started on Westlaw earlier, so I like to switch it up. And there are a couple of different ways. If you're looking for treatises in a particular area, obviously I can narrow directly to treatises. I can also do the I hope I'm getting lucky approach and just type in my word of interest. Again, this you only want to do if you've narrowed it down. You can see Lexis, is starting to suggest sources. So here's employee benefits law, ERISA, and beyond. So I would have gotten a little bit lucky in my let's hope I get lucky approach. Again, a better strategy, in my opinion, if you're just starting out in an area, limit to secondary sources. You've heard this now a bunch of times. I don't mind repeating it. I'm not tired yet. Secondary sources, and do my search. So HMO, liability. Because again, ultimately, in using secondary sources, your bottom line is how can I find resources to help increase my understanding? So I'm going to review and see what's here of interest. We've talked about this a little bit. And as I scroll down, I see here so let me make sure I show you what so I can scroll down and see what treatises they have. So these are all journals and law reviews. So in this instance, I may scroll through and think these are all law reviews. They're getting too specific and not talking about my issue. I haven't read them carefully enough to know that that's true for sure. So I may want to try again to narrow either by category, by source. So we already talked about this strategy with ALR and with jurisprudence. Now I might want something a little more in depth. Remember, treatises are more in depth. A lot of folks get hung up on what's exactly a treatise. And my answer is basically it is a title that's on a specific subject. And I don't mean article title because we just saw a whole bunch of article titles. By title, I mean the resource title. So the Hofstra Law Review is the resource title. It's not on a particular topic. Granted, the Hofstra Labor and Employment Law Journal is on a particular topic, but that is, again, a journal. So it's going to have articles within it on different topics. A treatise, again, is the title by a practitioner, by an expert in the field on a particular subject. And I know that's kind of a little fuzzy. And my answer to you is don't worry about it. If I ask you to find a treatise, one sure way is to narrow by treatises. And honestly, if I ask you to find a treatise and you come back and you give me an answer, and your proof of facts, I'm going to say this isn't really a treatise, but as long as it's helping you increase your understanding, you're good. So let's look at treatises because I want you to understand how to use them to the best effect. So I've narrowed to treatise. And scrolling down here, I see action based on quality of care, vicarious liability is in something called personal injury, actions, defenses, and damages. We're not really that interested in vicarious liability. So continuing on, I see another one. Oh, look, defenses based on preemption of claims. We know you're interested. Again, that same treatise, personal injury, action, and defenses, and damages, not images. So I'm going to take a look at that. And this may give me some background. It's talking about ERISA. So I'm certainly going to read more about that. It's pretty in-depth. It's going to give me references to cases. So all the great things that secondary sources do. And this entire treatise, I don't know if this is a 1-volume treatise. This could be a 15-volume treatise. Doesn't really matter. Again, volumes refers back to the print world. What does matter, referring back to the print world, is we are looking at Chapter 94, Managed Healthcare Organizations. And again, that chapter is an old print reference, right? Old print books had chapters. But understanding what that does for us will help you utilize this more effectively. I'm interested in managed healthcare organizations because I've now learned that an HMO is one type of managed healthcare organization. So I might want to look at that whole chapter. And looking over what Lexis does for us is it's giving me the different sections. So I'm in section 94.09, which is down here, but maybe 94.10, 94.11, here's they're talking about damages. Oh, look, 94.13 has got forms. We're not going to worry about that quite yet. But here, 94.01, understanding the managed healthcare industry. We already identified we need to know a little bit more about the contract and what the contract says, so that might help us give us some basic understanding of the industry. Oh, look, action based on quality of care, direct liability. Not sure quality of care that applies to us, but I'm going to read it. So looking at the table of contents helps us find other sections. And sure enough, 94.04, action based on denial of treatment. Bingo, right? We started at this treatise at 94.09. I mean, that was a good section too, right? We definitely want to read it. But looking at the table of contents, I don't know if my search results brought up 94.04, but I definitely want to look at it. So again, looking at the table of contents, Lexis makes it real easy for it. It's right there in front of us. Can be really important and really critical in helping us find useful resources. Again, I always want to be bibliographically aware. To do that on Lexis and treatises, I'm going to look up top. It's really not telling me anything. So if I go to the full table of contents, and up top, I can look at either the publication information or what's new. And it's likely to be, and there's where the publication update is. And so it's telling me, I don't know how they do this because they're looking into the future, February 2020. I'm kidding about that. Obviously, they just post date their updates. I don't know why, really. Okay, similarly, any questions? Similarly, on Westlaw, same strategy. I'm going to start secondary sources. Oh, also, I'll start out. I could also do see if I'm going to get lucky and type in Larissa. Again, I'll be with you in a second, Luke. Again, Westlaw pops up its AI guesses as to what it's guessing it thinks I'm asking. So when does ERISA preemption state law? I might even click on that. So some questions that do look promising. Westlaw will also give us content if we scroll down far enough and we see ERISA practice and procedure. So there's an example. Again, I am getting a little bit lucky if I type in the right word to see what other resources, ERISA practice litigation. So there are a couple here on Westlaw that might be of interest to me. Okay, Luke, question.
Westlaw, see Casey, like you can see other cases that have cited that case, right?
Right.
So next to we see that the 94.04 section really we see if any other treatises cited that section or any other sources section. You don't see citing references on Lexis.
So the answer is it depends on the source. I am going back to that particular section, and this particular treatise does not have a Shepherd-Eyes option. We'll see when we look at law reviews on Lexis that they do. And so the answer is if you're looking at it and you see Shepherd-Eyes, that's Lexis's equivalent of citing references. But excellent question. So back here on Westlaw, so I could see if I find anything just typing in the search box. If I do, great, take a look. If not, my standard strategy, secondary sources, I will type in my search. And on Westlaw, again, I'll review, see if I find anything good. If yes, great. If not, I'll say, okay, let me see what treatises they have. Under publication type, texts and treatises. And again, on Westlaw, I always have a hard time remembering what comes under publication type and what comes under publication name. Obviously, they're slightly different. I make my best guess, and if I don't find it in one, I just go to the other. It doesn't cost anything to investigate the filters on the side. So I am filtering to texts and treatises under publication type. That one I think is kind of easy to guess, but don't worry about it. And so texts and treatises cover a whole bunch of different types of resources. So we see Pennsylvania practice, we see our good old proof of facts, Florida jurisprudence. So for those of you in Florida, there's a special law, or going to Florida, I think a couple of you said you might go to Florida. There's Florida jurisprudence, just like New York jurisprudence, is a great source for law in that state. If somebody has a New York law question, and I'm at the reference desk, the first place I'm sending them is, and this is true, I have sent many an attorney to New York jurisprudence, and they've done very well. So similarly, Florida jurisprudence for Florida questions. So scrolling down these jurisprudence cause of action, I know I've looked at those. They're good or they're not good. And so here's one, HR series compensation and benefits. So I know this has to do with benefits and vicarious liability. I know I'm not interested in vicarious liability, but I know I'm interested in compensation and benefits. So I am going to use our new table of contents strategy. Once I get into the section, that is. Come on, Wessel, I'll give it a little encouragement. And sure enough, under this compensation and benefits treatise, Chapter 57, Other Legal Issues Affecting Healthcare Plans, and Part 3 of Chapter 57 is Managed Healthcare Liability Issues. And then subpart, Liability for Managed Care Provider Malpractice. And so within all of that, I've got vicarious liability, but if I look at my table of contents and I just click on whichever heading I think makes the most sense. So right now I'm picking liability for managed care provider malpractice. So I'm going to look under that and we see, I'm looking at 5744 vicarious liability, but sure enough, 5743, there's direct liability. So here's an example where my keyword search, the relevant section, at least not in the initial results. Maybe if I scroll down far enough, but by saying, okay, I think that treatise might be relevant, let me look at the table of contents. And if I'm patient enough for Westlaw to pull up direct liability, I can now see if this looks like it's going to help my understanding. And it talks a little bit about corporate negligence and direct liability. I don't know how much detail it goes into, but this is how I use the table of contents in order to help me find good sections within a treatise. Again, I think the table of contents is totally one of the most useful resources in research overall. And as I promise, I'll be talking about it quite a lot. Okay, so let's take a look at Bloomberg law. I'm going to go back here to the home page of Bloomberg. And actually on the home page, I talked about using the browse menu for the news or for the practice centers. So practice centers also would work looking for treatises, but there's also a link here for books and treatises. And what Bloomberg does is it brings up this search screen. So since I'm not sure which practice center I want, remember there was health, there was benefits, so this might be a better choice. Not that those would be bad choices. So again, I will try my HMO liability. And the one advantage Bloomberg will always have is it is flat rate. So if your organization is subscribing to Bloomberg, you don't have to worry about all those cost questions. Is it in my plan? Is it out of my plan? If I click on this, if I click on that, the answer is once you subscribe to Bloomberg, you can search it without worrying about cost. So here we bring up a couple of different treatises. actually one treatise really, ERISA Fiduciary Law. And so you can see what results on Bloomberg look like. And again, to find out, we want to always be bibliographically aware. For Bloomberg, you need to go to the title and then look at current through. And no, that's not particularly convenient, but that's how it works. So it's current through the end of 2015, which isn't very current, but at least now you know to what extent you can rely on it being up to date. Again, I'm not saying don't look at something from 2015. That's actually fairly recent. Just be aware that it's been a couple of years and there may have been some changes. Okay. The other aspect of Bloomberg I wanted to point out are these portfolios. I mentioned them earlier. Portfolios are a specialized publication by the old BNA that Bloomberg has imported into Bloomberg Law. And they're kind of cool because if you find one on the topic, so here's Portfolio 2800, Corporate Practice of Medicine, Prohibition, and here under the detailed analysis, malpractice liability of HMOs and other managed care organizations. So that looks pretty promising. And the thing with portfolios, I was looking for I'm being bibliographically aware, I was looking for the last updated. I clicked on the title and it didn't get me anywhere. I finally emailed our account representative and asked him, how do I tell? And his answer with portfolios, they're just updated on an ongoing basis. Whenever there's an update, because they're online, they just get updated. If the portfolio itself becomes out of date, they pull it. Or what they will do is you'll notice that this is Portfolio 2800 first. They might update it and it would become Portfolio 2800 second or third, however many times the whole thing has been revamped. So the answer is there is no way to tell other than doing what I did, which is emailing an account rep. Not that I'm suggesting that you do that. I'm now letting you know portfolios are just constantly updated. But just to reinforce the idea, you want to be thinking about this. Okay. It is now over time. As I expected, I didn't even get as far as I had hoped. So we will finish up with treatises and secondary sources next time. Please make sure to watch screencast number 3 on restatements. The link will go live in a couple of minutes. And if you didn't watch the first 2 screencasts, please watch those as well.